Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello and welcome to Group 7's presentation on Scenario 7, Assignment 2 in the Professional Nursing Practice paper. Group 7 is made up of myself, Jay, Tilly, Jonathan and Courtney. This assignment covers steps 1 through 11 in the Castell and Gall's decision-making framework. The introduction. Scenario 7 takes place around Grace, who is a 30-year-old oncology nurse who her colleagues suspect of misconduct. The problem is that Grace's colleagues are concerned she is neglecting patients, and they believe that this is the result of her stealing patients' medication for her own use. Therefore, step 2, facts, medical contextual policies and laws. It is important to understand what policies, laws and procedures have most relevance to Grace's misconduct. In New Zealand, citizens' civil and political rights are firstly protected by the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990. The Act guarantees the rights and freedoms of all New Zealanders. The 1993 Human Rights Act builds on the Bill of Rights Act by enhancing people's right to equal opportunity and aimed at preventing unfair treatment on the basis of irrelevant personal characteristics. The Human Rights Act covers discrimination based on race, age, sexuality, religion, taking place in employment, education, access to public places, provision of goods and services, housing and accommodation. There is one area, however, where the Human Rights Act falls short, and that is health. Although the rights of Grace's patients are covered by the Bill of Rights Act and the Human Rights Act with regard to unfair treatment, health is not specifically referenced in either piece of this legislation. In 1994, the Health and Disabilities Commission was established. Its specific aim was to advocate for the rights and fair treatment of patients at the hands of the New Zealand healthcare system. It also facilitates the patient's complaints process. In 1996, the Commission established or published the Code of Health and Disability Services Consumer Rights document, which contains 10 principles related to protecting patient rights as it applies to all health and disability service providers who are providing health and disability services to consumers. Health services are defined in the Act as health services. They include nurses, doctors and dentists. Every provider is subject to the duties in the code. Every provider must take action to inform consumers of their rights and enable them to exercise their rights. A provider should not breach the code if he or she has taken reasonable actions in circumstances to comply with the rights contained within the code. Right 4 is the most relevant within the code, as it covers the right to services of an appropriate standard. Within it are 5 clauses, and they contain specific references to reasonable care, legal, professional and ethical standards, consistent healthcare practices, minimising potential harm and optimising quality of life, and the 5th clause references continuity of services between healthcare providers. Grace's use of patient medication at the cost of patients' pain relief seriously impinges on these rights. Additionally, The DHB Grace works for will have specific policies which would prohibit the use of drugs and theft in the workplace, which she will be in breach of. These will carry their own penalties. Additionally, outside agencies such as Workplace New Zealand and the Health and Safety Act 2015 highlight the legal obligations employers have to take all practical steps to ensure workplace safety. Finally, and most troubling for Grace, is that she is breaking the law by stealing restricted drugs without a prescription. According to the 1961 Crimes Act, the sentence for stealing can be as much as 3 months in prison. Furthermore, the 1975 Misuse of Drugs Act could see Grace sentenced to a further 3 months for stealing C-class drugs such as codeine. Grace's misconduct is a very serious matter indeed. From a policies, procedures and law standpoint, now we'll look at the ethical side of the issue. Step 3. Ethical justification to resolve dilemma. We have highlighted 4 key aspects. The first is the principle of non-malfeasance. Non-malfeasance is non-malfeasance in short means to do no harm. This principle is intended so that all practitioners' decisions must consider whether other people or society will be harmed, even if the decision made would benefit the individual patient. The second aspect we identified is fidelity. Fidelity, in this instance, concerns building trusting relationships between healthcare providers and consumers. It is essential for healthcare consumers to trust nurses, being open and honest with risks and the burdens of the nurse. Grace's attitude is crucial to the patient's health. Additionally, fidelity requires that nurses are loyal, keeping promises and doing what is expected of them and perform their duties while being trustworthy. Courage is another aspect of ethical justification that we have highlighted in this scenario, and it references Plato's virtue ethics. It simply means having the courage to do something in the face of fear, where it is noble to do so or because it is disgraceful not to do so. The last aspect we have identified in this scenario is consequentialism. In this scenario, it means that Grace's actions are going to put patients' pain relief is going to be compromised, which is going to have the effect that her patients are going to have uncontrolled pain. Step 4. I will now pass over to Courtney, who will briefly cover Step 4.
In completing this step, we looked first at the cultural differences that Grace may be experiencing, having recently immigrated to New Zealand from the United Kingdom. However, there is little evidence to suggest that the cultural differences between the two nations are radically different. The only notable difference is that New Zealanders are stereotypically less highly strung, but due to our colonial history and contact with the UK, our culture is incredibly homogeneous. Because of this, we determined that there was no outstanding cultural differences to be aware of, other than that recent stress of leaving the UK might be impacting Grace. We then moved on to examine the duties and legal and ethical rights that needed to be addressed for Grace's situation. When examining this, the one that first comes to mind is the rights for Grace's patients to receive good quality care, which they are entitled to under Right 4 of the Code of Rights, and currently they are not getting. Grace also failing to live up to her duty of care through not practicing to the standards set for her and actively making choices that harm her patients. By selling pain medication, she is actively making the patient's recovery a worse experience. Grace was also going through a recent divorce, which may provide some more understanding behind her actions. However, it does not excuse them, because as a nurse, Grace should be able to recognise when she has become unfit to practice and request support and assistance from her colleagues. When it comes to cultural safety in the D'Souza article, it is difficult in this scenario to relate these ideas to Grace's misconduct. In fact, in this scenario, the person advocating for the patients in line with the ideas of the cultural safety referenced by D'Souza, sorry, I can't say that right, the other nurses on the ward and ourselves. That is if we decide to take action in the face of Grace's wrongdoing. Also, in step 5, we were asked to talk about the ethical dilemma apparent in this scenario. We have decided as a collective group that there was not one, and in fact there was a moral and legal duty for the nurse on the ward to act to avoid the possibility of future patient harm. In step 6, we examined guidelines from nursing and professional code of conducts. This included government, DHB and NZNO code of conducts. During this step, we clarified the values and breaches of the nursing code of conduct that needed to be considered. Of the code, Principle 4, that's the code of conduct, Principle 4 and Principle 7 were thought to be the most relevant. In this scenario, Grace is under suspicion of theft, misuse of substances negatively affecting the care of her patients. Principle 4 requires nurses to provide safe and competent care regardless of the circumstances behind her actions. Grace is failing to uphold this requirement. This is a breach of the value of non-maleficence, which requires that the nurse refrain from committing intentional harm. By providing poor quality care and denying care, Grace conflicts with this value. Specifically, Grace fails to uphold Clause 4.1 through failing to provide appropriate care and skill when treating patients. She fails to uphold Clause 4.9 through incorrectly administering medication. She is also failing to uphold Clause 4.10 through not practicing in accordance with her professional standards. Principle 4 requires that the nurse act with integrity, which requires that the nurse be held accountable for her actions and are not acting in ways that reflect poorly on the profession. The fact that Grace has been concealing her actions is a violation of the principle, as she is avoiding accountability and her actions reflect poorly on the profession. In particular, she violates Clause 7.1 by thieving her patient's medication, which she's suspected of. Grace is not being honest in her intentions with them, and Clause 7.5 through abusing her position as a nurse to gain professional benefit from her station. Grace's practice also does not meet the domains of her nursing competencies. Starting with the first section of Domain 1, Professional Responsibility, Competence 1.1 covers nurses accepting responsibility for ensuring nurses meet all legal and ethical requirements of practice. Grace has not been meeting these standards and thus is failing this competency. She also fails Competency 1.4, which requires the nurse to promote an environment of safety for health consumers. In step 7, we talk about relevant interdisciplinary resources. Due to Grace's evident misconduct, a number of relevant disciplinary resources apply. Grace's colleagues are concerned as they have come to believe that Grace is stealing her patient's medication. Grace's work on the oncology unit in New Zealand Hospital, where her work performance is overseen by a clinical nurse manager. The role of the clinical nurse manager is to evaluate the performance of the nurse within the unit, provide feedback and monitoring, encourage engagement in educational programs for nurses to further their skills, and contribute to staff development. Another key role of the clinical nurse educator is to monitor patient care for quality, ensuring that health consumers' safety, whilst also ensuring the safety and development of nurses under their delegation. According to New Zealand Nurses Organisation, its initial process of reporting misconduct within the workplace is through an incident report. These incident reports can be filled out when there has been an error that has or could potentially affect a patient care, or that there has been an incident including a patient which is inclusive of medication errors or falls. These two are the most applicable to our scenario. Grace's work colleagues have noticed that Grace's commitment to her patients is fading. She is becoming forgetful and experiencing mood swings, and her patient's pain is not being kept under control. Grace's work colleagues are concerned that she might be taking their medication. Initially a very dedicated nurse, Grace has experienced a difficult divorce with which has undoubtedly affected her mental health and well-being. This could be contributing to unsafe nursing practice. The clinical nurse manager may recognise that Grace is struggling in her work and may suggest a counselling service or helpline. NZNO have a phone support centre dedicated to providing help for New Zealand nurses. Through an incident report, a clinical nurse manager may suggest that the nurse takes some time off or a more thorough investigation is held. If the initial investigation finds that Grace is indeed stealing medication from her patients, then a complaint to the Nursing Council New Zealand would be the next port of action. Any complaints received by the Nursing Council New Zealand which have directly affected a health consumer must be referred to the Council to the Health and Disability Commissioner. From there, the Health and Disability Commissioner may decide to investigate the complaint further or may refer the complaint back to the Nursing Council. The complaint should be written out in a letter form with the necessary information included. Complaints of a serious nature, such as stealing medications from a patient, are investigated and considered by the Professional Conduct Committee. The PCC is the investigatory body appointed by the Medical Council under Section 71 of the Health Practitioners Competency Assurance Act. The PCC investigates the complaint and decides whether to refer to the Health Practitioner Disciplinary Tribunal or to take no further disciplinary action. If the complaint reaches the tribunal, a hearing is held, and if found guilty, a health practitioner could face either of these penalties. Either the registration of the health practitioner may be cancelled, order that the registration of the health practitioner is suspended for a year, suspended for a period not exceeding 3 years, or even that the health practitioner may get a $30,000 fine. If found guilty of stealing medication from her patients, Grace could face either of these penalties as determined by the tribunal.
Step 8. In this scenario, we as a group decided that there was no alternative action or option to be taken as regards Grace's misconduct. Step 9 highlights the morally justifiable action that we are to take in this scenario. It highlights the duty that nurses have around Grace's misconduct and the act that they must undertake in line with the morals and ethics brought out in step 3. These are non-malfeasance, to do no harm, to stop Grace from stealing patients' medication, causing them harm, fidelity, to uphold the duty of care of nurses and their rights and responsibilities around Grace's misconduct, courage, the courage that we'll need to report Grace's misconduct, and consequentialism is what will happen if we fail to act in this scenario, and that is that Grace's patients will be caused further harm. Step 10 is to act. I will pass you on to Courtney for this part.
To act, it is suggested that we found that to report Grace as soon as possible to the clinical nurse manager. We also found to do this along with other nurses on the ward for both moral and ethical support. The problem that we found is that Grace has been seen displaying drug-seeking tendencies. This is a concern as they have also witnessed evidence which points to her having a drug problem. Grace's work colleagues are growing concerned for the safety of her patients, as they often find Grace's patients' pain is not kept under control. They suspect that Grace is stealing the pain medication for her own use. This suspected misconduct cannot continue and the action needs to be taken. As outlined before in step 7, Grace's work colleagues would initially voice their concerns to the clinical nurse manager through an incident report. However, the nurse would need some form of evidence to back up the claims. The clinical nurse manager would review this, deciding whether to take it further by writing a written complaint to the Nursing Council New Zealand. When doing this, all information needs to be clearly stated in the complaint form. The complaint form can be accessed via the Nursing Council New Zealand website for both health practitioners and the general public. After the complaint form has been submitted, it is in the hands of the New Zealand Council New Zealand. If an investigation is put into place, the nurse might be asked to take some time off, or her scope might be monitored until a verdict has been met. This process can take weeks, months, or even longer. Therefore, dealing with these types of issues in the workplace can be a lengthy process. Just for interest's sake, in 2015, a Dunedin registered nurse was found guilty of stealing hundreds of prescription drugs. The nurse was ordered to pay $16,000 in reparation costs. She also lost her registration, therefore she is no longer able to practice within New Zealand.
The last step, step 11, in the Castell and Gould's ethical decision-making framework, is to evaluate the process. After reporting Grace, it is important to evaluate what the nurse can have done better to make sure that patients' rights and the duty of care as nurses is met, to make sure that anything that is missed can be approved and covered in the future. However, we as a group found that we could have done little to improve this process based on the parameters assigned. It did highlight, however, to us all the duty of care as nurses, the various policies and guidelines that we must be aware of, and additionally, we should always observe and be aware of the actions of fellow nurses, and if we see them doing something inappropriate or any form of misconduct, we should be comfortable in reporting them to the proper authorities, and this process allows us to better understand that process. On behalf of Group 7, IJ and Courtney, Tilly and Jonathan, thank you very much for your attendance. We very much enjoyed this project on Castell and Gould's ethical decision-making framework, supplemented with D'Souza's supplemented by D'Souza's cultural safety. So we are looking forward to next year, and we thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.